I'm Hannah Reeves, 24 years old, and the night the celebration photos were still warm on my phone, I was back at my parents' table in Springfield, Massachusetts, listening to the soft clink of silverware and the long stretch of quiet that always comes before the next remark, the one that lands like a small stone in the chest, cool and heavy. The house looked exactly like the ones beside it. Trim yard flag bracket on the porch light, glowing buttery gold. Yet every time the front door shut behind me, the rooms felt tighter, as if the walls remembered things I was trying to forget. I kept my diploma safe in its leather folder on the chair beside me, close enough to touch, far enough to keep clean. My father tasted his coffee and watched me over the rim. My mother passed the carrots and mentioned a neighbor's daughter landing something substantial downtown. Across from me, my brother scrolled his phone, smiling at a screen that seemed to treat him kinder than we treated one another. By dessert, the air held a quiet I knew too well, the kind that means someone has decided a point needs making. I folded my napkin and waited, telling myself not to swallow too fast, not to show anything before I had to. I had no way to know how far that moment would reach into the life I was just beginning. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your worth under someone else's roof. I grew up in this town where the streets meet at right angles, and the same maple trees mark the seasons for everyone on the block, where you wave to people you don't know by name and bring casseroles when storms knock out the power. My parents taught tidy things: say thank you, hold the door, don't leave a mess on the counter. And I learned early how to stack plates, balance a grocery list, and make small talk with neighbors on the sidewalk. We weren't fancy, just steady, the kind of family that kept a shoe tray by the back door and a jar of loose screws on the garage shelf. When I left for Northeastern in Boston, I stepped into a different rhythm. Trains that breathed in and out of stations, glass front offices that smelled like coffee and printer ink. Late nights in the library where the hum of other people working made you sit straighter. The city had a way of reminding you how many lives were moving beside your own. The campus did too, with its stairwells and bulletin boards and the brisk shuffle of people holding on to plans. By the time the caps and gowns were boxed away, I wasn't standing where I thought I'd stand. But I was standing one foot in a marketing internship in the city, one foot in a bookstore job that kept the lights on both feet tired in a way that felt honest. Each morning I rode the inbound trains with the office crowd, the windows fogged from our breath and the air smelling faintly of wet wool and coffee lids. Each evening I shelved paperbacks and straightened displays, collecting small gratitudes like quiet tips, a customer's thanks, a manager's nod, a schedule posted with my name where I'd asked it to be. It wasn't a headline life, but it was mine, and I was careful with it. I kept a budget on a yellow legal pad, brought lunch from home in reused containers, and mended a frayed sweater sleeve with a needle from the junk drawer. When I came back to Springfield at night, the turn from the state road onto our street felt familiar under the tires, and yet the minute the porch light picked me out, something in my shoulders lifted and didn't come down. At the table talk settled into grooves. Everyone knew how so-and-so's son landed a position with a bonus, how a cousin closed on a condo near the river, how good habits separate people who move forward from people who drift. My father kept his voice level the way you do when you want your words to carry without sounding like you're trying. My mother added details like she was dusting the surface of a room, quick and thorough. Tyler's laughter drifted from something on his phone, and my mother reached over to set a second helping by his plate, as if praise itself could be served warm. I found myself measuring the distance between the world I was building, a small studio apartment circled in red on a map in my head, bus transfers, memorized resumes, adjusted late at night, and the one inside these walls where every story seemed to arrive finished neat and impressive. The middle parts smoothed out until they shone. The distance wasn't only about money, though. Money sat there like an extra guest. It was about who counted as arriving and who still looked like they were waiting at the station. I kept my voice easy and my answers short, describing my days in the city the way you might describe a road you know by feel, which corner to cross on the light, which elevator stalls, which team lead prefers bullet points, which one wants a picture first. No one was unkind outright. It was more the way certain sentences stopped just before they reached me, the way a compliment could leave a thin shadow if you tilted it. I learned to smile at the right places and cut my food small. When I washed the dishes afterward, the window over the sink gave me a picture of the yard that looked like a postcard grass-trimmed fence, straight porch steps clean, and I could hear the murmur of voices from the other room comfortable and low. I dried the plates and stacked them in the cabinet, set the glasses upside down on the shelf, folded the dish towel along the seam. In the quiet that followed, I sat again and wrapped my fingers around the water glass to warm them, and the room felt like a stage just before someone steps into the light. My sister Vanessa had moved away years ago, a state line or two between her and the old arguments. She called sometimes, and when she did, her voice carried a patience I didn't know how to keep in the house. My brother had the promise of a future that seemed to arrive early for him. People said it that way, as if he'd been moved up a line without asking. I had a ledger instead, hours worked trains, made rent, imagined in the margin with a neat box around it, groceries added and subtracted, a small emergency column drawn in pencil. On commuting mornings, Boston felt like the place where effort had a clear shape. On Springfield nights, effort felt invisible, like breath on a cold window. You wipe away with your sleeve only to see it gather again. That evening, the clock in the kitchen ticked louder than usual, and I could feel the table settling around something that hadn't been said. I looked at my diploma case on the chair beside me, and then back at the faces I've known my whole life, each of us fixed in our familiar spots, under the same ceiling light we'd eaten under for years. My father's hand rested on the table, his index finger tapping once, twice the way he does when he's measuring how to begin. My mother straightened the salt and pepper as if the moment required a tidier frame. Tyler's phone went screen dark, his thumb hovering, waiting. The porch light was still on outside, casting a pale triangle on the front steps, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked once and went quiet. I set my glass down and folded the napkin in my lap, and the soft scrape of the chair leg against the floor sounded louder than it should have. My father cleared his throat, steadied his gaze, and began to speak. My father rested his hands flat on the table, the edge of his wedding ring glinting under the kitchen light. His tone was almost casual, as if he were announcing the weather. "Starting next month," he said, "you'll need to start paying rent if you want to keep staying here." The words landed clean and heavy, cutting through the quiet clatter of dinner. I thought for a moment I'd misunderstood him, but the look on his face left no room for that. He continued eating like nothing unusual had been said. My mother didn't miss a beat. She set down her fork, folded her napkin, and added, "Maybe it'll teach you some respect." The sentence came wrapped in the kind of satisfaction that stings more than it sounds. The only thing I could hear after that was the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I looked down at my plate, the steam still curling from the green beans I'd barely touched. My brother shifted in his chair, suppressing a smirk. My mouth went dry, but I managed to ask quietly, "Rent, you mean here?" My father didn't even glance up. "You've been living here long enough," he said, scooping another bite of food. "You're out of college now. It's time to start acting like an adult." My mother nodded, her tone light but sharp. "Everyone else's kids help with expenses. We've carried you long enough." The word carried sank into me like a stone. I'd been juggling 2 jobs for months, waking before sunrise to catch the train to Boston for my internship, then rushing back to cover evening shifts at the bookstore. Every check went toward my own bills, my phone, my car groceries. I bought myself gas student loans. Yet to them, none of that mattered. They only saw what I hadn't done, what I wasn't yet earning the dream salary someone else's daughter had. I wanted to remind them that I was trying, that starting out takes time, but the words tangled in my throat. My father's expression stayed steady, the kind of look that didn't invite explanation. Across the table, my mother leaned back slightly, watching me as if waiting for me to protest so she could scold me for doing so. The air in the room thickened until every breath felt heavy. "I already help with the bills," I said quietly. "I've given you money from every paycheck since I started working." My father's hand waved in the air, dismissive. "That little bit doesn't even count. We still feed you, don't we?" My mother pressed her lips together, her tone cool. "People who really work don't complain about helping." Tyler chuckled under his breath, the sound small but cruel. "Guess that means you'll finally start pulling your weight." he muttered, reaching for another roll. My mother shot him a look that was meant to be disapproving but came out more like amusement. My father didn't say a word. My chest tightened. The kitchen, usually smelling of warm butter and coffee, felt suddenly foreign. I'd sat at that table every night of my life, but that evening I felt like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I set my fork down carefully, afraid even the sound might crack the silence wider. I finished the rest of my meal in small, tasteless bites. No one spoke again except for the scrape of silverware and the dull clink of glasses. When I excused myself and pushed my chair back, neither of my parents looked up. My brother was still chewing phone in one hand, fork in the other. Upstairs, my room was exactly as I'd left it that morning, neat, ordinary, the comforter still tucked tight, the small desk by the window cluttered with half-read books and job applications. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my hands. 100 thoughts moved through my mind at once: anger, confusion, disbelief, and something deeper, an ache that reached all the way back through every small moment when I'd tried to prove myself and still came up short. I told myself maybe they'd spoken out of frustration, that maybe tomorrow would bring an apology, or at least a softer conversation. But another voice whispered that this wasn't sudden, it was simply the final step in a pattern that had been building for years. The comparisons at dinner, the sighs, the subtle digs about my choices, it all pointed here. I was no longer their daughter trying to make her way. I was a bill to be collected. Downstairs, laughter drifted faintly through the floorboards, my parents and Tyler chatting about his upcoming semester, about how promising his future looked. Their voices were light again, easy. Mine had already been erased from the conversation. I reached for my old suitcase in the closet, the one I'd used through college moves, and pulled it out slowly. The zipper rasped open like a quiet decision being made. I folded clothes with hands that barely felt steady. Jeans, sweaters, the plain white blouse I wore to interviews. I packed my laptop, my worn leather notebook, the silver bracelet Grace had given me for my 21st birthday, and a framed photo of my grandmother smiling in the garden behind her house. Each item went into the suitcase like proof that I still existed somewhere beyond their judgment. By midnight, the house was still. I moved carefully, not wanting the floorboards to creak. My parents' door was closed. Faint light glowed from under the edge, then disappeared. When I reached the front door, I paused for a moment, hand on the knob. The porch light burned bright against the quiet street. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the smell of wet grass and pavement. My old car sat under the street lamp, the hood speckled with dust. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, I just sat there, hands on the wheel, the silence pressing around me. Then I started the engine. The sound broke through the still night like the first crack of a storm. As I drove away, the houses blurred into rows of muted colors. Every streetlight I passed felt like a mile of distance I'd needed for years but hadn't known how to take. By the time I reached the highway, tears had dried on my cheeks. The sky above Worcester was a dull gray, the kind that sits low and still before morning. When I pulled up outside Grace Porter's apartment, it was almost 2 a.m. I knocked lightly, hoping I hadn't woken the entire building. Grace opened the door within seconds, hair-tousled eyes blinking against the light. "Hannah," she whispered. "What happened?" I didn't have the words. I just held up the suitcase. Her expression softened, and she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry soap. She cleared a spot on the couch and pulled a blanket over the armrest. I sat down, the cushions dipping beneath me, the weight of the past hours finally catching up. Grace handed me a glass of water, then sat beside me without asking questions. "Stay as long as you need," she said simply. I knotted my throat tight and whispered, "Thank you." That night, I barely slept. The street outside hummed with the faint sound of passing cars, and the moonlight stretched across the floor like a thin thread of silver. My phone lit up several times on the coffee table calls from home, but I turned it face down. I wasn't ready. When morning came, the world felt both fragile and new. I dressed quietly and left early for my shift at the bookstore, the air still damp from the night's rain. On the bus, I watched people scrolling through their phones, sipping coffee, lost in their own mornings. Mine felt like it had started over completely. That evening, as I was restocking a shelf near the front window, my phone buzzed again. My father's name flashed across the screen. For a long time, I just stared at it. Finally, I answered. His voice was sharp with worry. "Hannah, your room is empty. Where are you?" I closed my eyes for a second, steadied my breath, and said, "You told me to start paying to stay, so I left." There was a pause long enough that I could hear his breathing change on the other end. "That's not what we meant," he said finally. "You can't just walk out." I felt something steady rise in me. "I'm not walking out," I said. "I'm just done begging to belong." Before he could reply, I ended the call. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone back in my pocket, but inside a quiet calm had started to form a feeling that maybe leaving wasn't running away, after all. That calm didn't last long. By the next morning, messages began flooding in. My mother's text came first, accusing, then pleading. My father sent short-clipped lines. "You're being dramatic. We didn't raise you to be ungrateful." Then came Tyler's message, casual and cutting. "Adults pay rent." "Hannah, guess it's about time you grew up." Each notification felt like a spark hitting dry leaves quick and hot, but I didn't answer. Grace noticed the look on my face and asked softly, "Still them?" I nodded. She didn't press. She just reached over, turned down the volume on the TV, and said, "You don't have to explain anything tonight." I sank deeper into the couch, the fabric warm from the afternoon sun. Somewhere between exhaustion and relief, I realized I'd crossed a line I couldn't step back over. The house in Springfield wasn't my home anymore. It was just the place I'd finally learned to leave. Outside, the sky darkened early, and the hum of the city filled the quiet room. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and thought about how the story might look when they told it to others that I'd left over money, that I was ungrateful, maybe even selfish. But deep down, I knew the truth. And though I didn't yet know what would come next, I knew one thing clearly: I was not going back. That thought followed me into sleep, steady as the rain tapping softly against the window. It was the sound of something ending and something else fragile but certain just beginning. The days after I left Springfield blurred together a mix of long work shifts, late bus rides, and the soft hum of city noise outside Grace's apartment window. I'd wake before dawn, fix instant coffee in her small kitchen, and head out with my backpack slung over my shoulder. The mornings felt strange, quiet, but unsettled, like I was still waiting for the weight of what I'd done to hit me fully. By the end of the first week, it did. My phone filled with messages so quickly I stopped checking for a while. The vibration seemed constant, like a heartbeat that wouldn't rest. Most of the messages were from my parents. My father's words came clipped and cold, the kind of tone he used when scolding a stranger. "We raised you better than this. You don't just walk out on family." Then my mother's longer ones arrived, paragraphs that started with guilt and ended with accusation. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us. You left over a little rent." Her voice seemed to echo in every word that same tone she used when I was a teenager trying to explain a bad grade. When I finally checked the family group chat, my brother had joined in. Guess she didn't want to grow up, he'd written, followed by a laughing emoji. "Adults pay their own way." I read the line 3 times, my stomach tightening a little more each time. I imagined my mother seeing it, smiling faintly, maybe even agreeing. The rest of the family would see it too. My aunts, my cousins, and I could already picture their nods, their quiet exchanges about the daughter who'd run away from home because she didn't want responsibility. Grace noticed how quiet I'd become. One night, she found me sitting on the couch with the lights off my phone face down beside me. She handed me a cup of tea and asked softly, "Still getting messages?" I nodded but didn't say much. The steam rose between us, warm and fleeting. She didn't ask for details, just sat beside me in silence. Sometimes that was all I needed. A few days later, I got a call from Vanessa. She hadn't been part of the chaos at home for years. When her name flashed on the screen, I hesitated, then answered. "Mom's telling everyone you stormed out because you didn't want to help with expenses," she said right away, her voice low and calm. "They're saying you're acting spoiled." I sank back into the couch, my throat tightening. "So they've rewritten the whole story," I said quietly. Vanessa sighed. "Yeah, she's painting it like you overreacted to a normal request. You know how she is." Her words didn't surprise me. I'd seen it happen before, how easily truth could bend in that house. Still hearing it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit, that they weren't just angry, they were erasing me. The more I stayed silent, the easier it became for them to fill in the blanks however they wanted. That night, I sat staring at my phone again, scrolling through the messages I hadn't answered. The longer I read, the heavier my chest felt. None of them asked if I was safe or where I was staying. Every line circled back to the same themes: guilt, control, and image. I set the phone down and rubbed my temples, trying to block out the noise in my head. The silence that followed was almost worse. Grace walked in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "You look like you're fighting ghosts," she said softly. I tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach. "They're just not letting up." She sat across from me, her voice gentle. "You don't have to prove anything to them, you know." I wanted to believe that, but part of me still longed for even a sliver of understanding from my parents. That small, stubborn hope was harder to let go of than I expected. The following week was a blur of work. I picked up extra hours at the bookstore and volunteered to stay late at the marketing firm, anything to keep from going back to Grace's apartment and checking my phone again. At night, I'd fall asleep on her couch with the TV humming softly, only to wake before sunrise and start again. Each morning, the mirror in her bathroom showed a version of me a little more tired than the day before. One Friday evening, after closing the bookstore, I walked out into the crisp air and stood under the streetlight for a while. The autumn chill cut through my sweater, but I didn't move. Cars passed slowly on the wet pavement, headlights streaking across the storefront windows. I thought about home, about the porch light that probably still came on every night at 7, about the faint smell of my mother's cooking drifting through the neighborhood. Those memories felt like photographs, now flat distant, unable to reach back. When I returned to Grace's apartment, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a voicemail. My mother's voice filled the small living room as soon as I pressed play. "Hannah, this has gone on long enough. You can't hide forever. Come home and apologize. We'll forget this ever happened." Her tone was firm, almost rehearsed. She ended with, "You're still our daughter, but you need to act like one." I sat there for a long time after the message ended, the sound of her voice still echoing in my head. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. She wasn't asking me to come home. She was demanding that I surrender. I deleted the message, turned off the phone, and let the quiet fill the space again. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of rain tapping the window. Grace was already dressed for work. "You okay?" she asked as she poured a cup for me. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Just tired," I said. She smiled slightly. "You're stronger than you think." Her words lingered with me that day. At the firm, while typing up reports, I kept hearing them in my head, steady, simple, certain. Maybe strength wasn't loud. Maybe it was just choosing not to go back, even when the familiar called your name. Still, the loneliness was sharp. Nights stretched long, and sometimes I caught myself scrolling through old photos, birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners. My family looked picture-perfect in those images, smiles lined up neatly, hands on shoulders, eyes bright for the camera. But I remembered the moments between the flashes, the sighs, the silences, the quiet, cutting words that never made it into any frame. As the weeks passed, the calls slowed, but the ache didn't. Every time I saw an older couple at the bookstore browsing together, I wondered if they'd ever made their children feel small just for trying. Some evenings I'd walk home along the river, the streetlights reflecting off the water, and think about how easily love could turn into leverage in that house. One night near the end of October, my phone lit up with Vanessa's name again. I answered quickly, my heart pounding. "You should know," she said quietly. "Mom told Aunt Carol you left because you refused to help with Dad's mortgage. She's saying you're selfish." I felt my jaw tighten. "They're really telling everyone, aren't they?" She sighed. "Yeah, I just wanted you to hear it from me before you see it spreading around the family." After we hung up, I stared out the window at the dark sky. It struck me that my absence hadn't softened them. It had given them space to rewrite the story. They needed a version where I was the villain, where their actions were reasonable and their disappointment justified. I realized then that staying silent wasn't protecting me anymore. It was letting them shape who I was to everyone else. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake on the couch watching the clock tick past midnight. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image, my old bedroom door, with a new nameplate on it, Tyler's things filling the space that once held my life. The thought pressed hard against my chest until I couldn't lie still anymore. I got up, walked into the small bathroom, and looked at my reflection under the pale light. My eyes were tired, but something inside them felt steadier than before. The silence around me wasn't empty, it was waiting. I whispered to the mirror, the words barely audible. They can tell their story. I'll live mine. The apartment was still, the rain had stopped, and somewhere in the distance, the city trains hummed through the night. I turned off the light and returned to the couch, pulling the blanket over my shoulders. The hum outside faded into quiet, and for the first time since leaving home, that quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like the beginning of something else. What I didn't know then was that this new beginning would soon grow into something even stronger, a determination that would change everything that came next. The morning after that long, restless night, the air in Grace's apartment felt heavier than usual. Sunlight crept through the blinds in thin streaks across the carpet, and for the first time since I left home, I didn't rush out the door. I sat at the edge of the couch holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. I wasn't crying anymore. I'd run out of tears somewhere between my mother's last voicemail and my brother's smug messages. All that was left now was exhaustion and a faint sense of resolve beginning to take shape beneath it. I stood and walked to the bathroom, catching my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. My hair was a tangled mess, my eyes swollen from too many sleepless nights. For a long moment, I just looked at myself. The silence pressed close until I finally whispered the words that had been waiting somewhere deep inside me. You're not going to cry for them anymore. The sound of it was quiet, almost foreign, but it steadied me. That morning marked the start of something different. I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter, pulled up my budget spreadsheet, and began listing every expense, every bit of income, every possibility. Rent, food, train fare, savings. I didn't have much, but I had enough to start somewhere. Grace noticed me scribbling notes on a pad and smiled softly. "Planning something big?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm going to get my own place," I said. She didn't question how or when, just squeezed my shoulder and said, "Then we'll make it happen." The next few weeks became a blur of long hours and quiet determination. I volunteered for extra shifts at the bookstore, often closing late at night, then catching the early train into Boston the next morning for my internship. The commute was rough, but I stopped complaining even to myself. Every hour meant another small step forward. My manager at the store started trusting me with more responsibilities, restocking orders, helping with displays, training new staff. At the firm, I asked to assist with side projects others had ignored. The workload doubled, but so did my focus. By the second month, my body was constantly tired, but there was a sense of motion that kept me going. I'd fall asleep on Grace's couch with my laptop still open and wake to her leaving a sticky note on the coffee table that said things like, "Keep going, you're doing great," or "Don't forget to eat breakfast." Those notes became my small collection of courage reminders that I wasn't completely alone. On the nights when the apartment was quiet and the city sounds drifted faintly through the window, I'd pull out a notebook and jot down my goals. Nothing grand, just things like find a place before spring, finish marketing certification course, save 1,000 by next month. Seeing the words on paper made it real. The page filled slowly with plans that no one could take away from me. When winter came, the bookstore's windows fogged from the heat inside, and customers rushed in with scarves pulled tight around their faces. My shifts stretched into 12-hour days, but I stopped keeping count. I lived on coffee sandwiches and determination. Some nights Grace would leave a warm meal waiting when I came home late. Other nights she'd already be asleep, and I'd sit quietly with the city lights flickering across the living room. Those moments made me realize that freedom didn't have to look glamorous. Sometimes it just looked like peace. In February, the marketing firm offered me a small stipend for the extra projects I'd helped complete. It wasn't much, but when I saw the deposit hit my account, I felt my throat tighten. It was the first time in months that someone had recognized my effort with something tangible. I opened my spreadsheet again, recalculated my budget, and for the first time the numbers actually worked. By early March, I found a small studio apartment in Cambridge, barely 600 square feet, with scuffed floors and a single window that faced a narrow alley. The landlord handed me the keys in a plain white envelope, and I remember standing outside the door for a few minutes before unlocking it. The air inside was musty, the walls marked with faint traces of old paint, but to me, it felt like sunlight. I set my suitcase down in the middle of the room and just stood there breathing it in. It took a few days to make the place livable. I bought a used desk from a thrift shop, a second-hand mattress from a student moving out, and a small yellow lamp that filled the room with a soft glow. Grace helped me carry in boxes on her day off. When we finished, we sat on the floor, eating takeout, looking around at the scattered furniture. "It's perfect," she said. I nodded. "It's mine." That first night alone, I didn't sleep much. I lay on the mattress with the city noise drifting through the cracked window and the hum of the radiator filling the silence. The air smelled faintly of paint and new beginnings. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to wake up. The days fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were quiet. I'd brew cheap coffee in a dented metal pot, open the window to let the cold air in, and sit by the desk as sunlight crept across the floorboards. I paid my own bills, cooked simple meals, and kept every receipt neatly folded in a drawer. Every small act felt like reclaiming something I didn't know I'd lost. At work, I started to find my footing. My supervisor noticed how often I stayed late to polish reports and asked me to help train the next group of interns. "You've got a good eye for detail," she said, handing me a stack of files. Those words carried more warmth than any compliment I'd heard at home. At the bookstore, my manager promoted me to assistant floor lead, a small raise that felt huge in my world. By spring, the studio started to look like home. I hung a few photos on the wall, one of me and Grace at the park, one of my grandmother smiling on her porch, and a few printed quotes that reminded me to keep going. When I finally bought a small sofa from a second-hand shop in Somerville, I called Grace over. The two of us hauled it up the narrow staircase, laughing breathlessly as we wedged it through the door. When we finally set it down, we collapsed onto it, laughing until our sides ached. It wasn't fancy, but it was something solid I could sit on at the end of the day and think I earned this. Each night before bed, I'd turn on the yellow lamp, wrap myself in a blanket, and write in my notebook. The list of goals kept growing: enroll in evening classes, apply for full-time position, save for a better car. There was comfort in seeing progress take shape on paper. Even when I came home too tired to cook, I still wrote something, one line, one plan, one reminder that tomorrow could be better. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, wondering if my parents would ever reach out again, not with blame, but with understanding. The screen stayed dark most days, and I learned to stop expecting it to light up. The quiet between us became its own kind of answer. Then one afternoon, while organizing a display at the bookstore, my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Call me when you're home," it read. The tone of it made my stomach twist, but I waited until my shift ended before returning the call. Her voice was hesitant. "I didn't want to text this, but you should know why they pushed you so hard about rent," she said. "Dad refinanced the house last year to cover part of Tyler's startup costs. They're stretched thin now. They wanted you to help make up the difference." I stood frozen beside the display table, her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. So that was it. All the lectures about responsibility, all the guilt, they weren't about teaching me to grow up. I had just been their backup plan. The quiet on the line stretched before Vanessa spoke again. "I thought you should hear it from me," she said softly. "I know it's a lot." When we hung up, I walked outside, the late afternoon sun glinting off the bookstore window. The street was crowded, but everything felt strangely still. I leaned against the brick wall, the truth sinking deeper with every breath. My parents hadn't been trying to teach me independence. They were trying to use me to fix what they'd broken. That night I sat in my studio with the lamp glowing beside me, staring at the blank page in my notebook. For a long time I didn't write anything. Then slowly I picked up my pen and began listing the pieces of what I'd learned. Every message, every insult, every time they'd made me feel small, all of it lined up in black ink. It wasn't for revenge or proof. It was so I wouldn't forget. When I finished, I closed the notebook and looked around the room that I had built from nothing. The hum of the city filled the air, steady and alive. Somewhere beneath the ache, a new thought began to form, quiet but strong. I wasn't the burden they'd made me believe I was. I was the evidence of everything they had underestimated. The next morning I woke before sunrise, brewed my coffee, and opened the window to let the cool air brush across my face. The city was still half asleep, and for once I felt completely awake. The hurt was still there, but beneath it something else had taken root, a calm certainty that this was only the beginning of my own story. After Vanessa's call, the quiet of my studio apartment changed. The space that had once felt safe now carried the echo of every truth I didn't want to face. I sat at the small table near the window, the city noise faint below, and tried to piece together what she'd said. My parents hadn't wanted me to grow. They'd wanted me to pay for their choices. I was never a daughter learning independence. I'd been their backup plan. That thought stayed with me all night, circling until morning came. By dawn, I was still awake, the yellow lamp casting a tired glow across my notebook. I opened a new page and began writing, not out of anger, but to make sense of what had happened. I listed each thing I knew, their messages, their words the night I left, the truth about the refinanced house. One line after another filled the page until it looked less like a journal and more like evidence. When I finally stopped, I read it back slowly. The anger had softened into something steadier. I realized I didn't need to confront them right away. I just needed to remember. The next weeks passed quietly. I threw myself into work, focusing on what I could control. My supervisor at the firm, a patient man named David Kent, started giving me bigger projects, drafting client reports, designing presentation slides, even leading a small meeting. He noticed the effort. "You're thorough, Hannah," he said one afternoon, glancing at my notes. "Keep that up, and you'll have a full-time offer before summer." The words lit a spark inside me. I stayed late that night, double-checking data and revising layouts until the office lights dimmed. At the bookstore, I became the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. When the register froze or a shipment arrived mislabeled, I was the one who stayed late to sort it out. My managers started trusting me with closing shifts, handing me the keys without hesitation. The work was simple but grounding, and every paycheck I deposited felt like another small victory. I kept my expenses tight, no takeout, no new clothes, no extras. Every dollar had a place to go. In April, I bought a used laptop from a coworker leaving town. It wasn't much, but it ran fast enough to let me take evening courses online. I enrolled in a marketing certification program using the money I'd saved instead of touching a credit card. Some nights I'd sit at the desk until midnight, typing notes with the hum of traffic below my window. It was exhausting, but the kind of exhaustion that meant something. On weekends, Grace would stop by with groceries or bring coffee from the cafe down the street. She'd look around the little apartment, smile, and say, "You're really doing this." I'd laugh and shake my head, one day at a time. We'd sit on the old sofa I'd hauled up those narrow stairs and talk about ordinary things, her job at the clinic, my classes, how the city was already turning green again. It was simple, but it felt like life finally settling into place. Then one Sunday afternoon, while cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed. The message came from an unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately. "Family gathering this weekend. Come home. Mom." My hands froze above the sink. The text wasn't warm or emotional, just short and commanding. For a while I stared at it, unsure if it was an olive branch or another trap. Eventually, I set the phone face down and finished washing the dishes. The next few days passed in quiet tension. I told Grace about the message, half expecting her to say I should ignore it. Instead, she asked, "Do you want to go?" I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I finally said. "It feels like they're calling me back for a reason." Grace nodded slowly. "Then find out. But go on your terms." By Friday night, I'd made up my mind. I opened my closet and took out the navy suit I'd bought months earlier for job interviews. It was neat, simple, and felt like armor. I pressed it carefully, shined my shoes, and packed a folder into my bag, the one holding every text, every voicemail, and photos of my old bedroom, already filled with Tyler's things. I didn't plan to use it, but I needed it with me. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright. I left early, driving the hour and a half to Springfield with the radio off. The streets looked the same, but something in me had shifted. When I turned into our neighborhood, the sight of the house made my stomach tighten. The porch still had the same chipped paint, and my mother's flowers bloomed neatly along the fence. Tyler's car gleamed in the driveway. I parked by the curb, took a deep breath, and walked up the path. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her smile was wide, too practiced. "Hannah," she said brightly, "you came." She reached out for a hug, and though I returned it politely, it felt distant, like touching a photograph. My father appeared from the kitchen, his expression calm but watchful. "We're glad you could make time," he said. The table was already set for lunch, plates aligned perfectly, silverware glinting under the light. We sat down, the conversation starting with small talk about work and the weather. Tyler scrolled through his phone, barely looking up. My mother asked about Boston traffic. My father commented on gas prices. Everything felt rehearsed, as if we were all actors waiting for our cues. I took small bites, the air around us tightening with unspoken tension. Finally, my father cleared his throat, setting his fork down with a soft click. "We need to discuss something serious," he began, his tone even. "The mortgage is higher than expected this year. Your mother and I have been trying to manage, but it's becoming difficult." My mother leaned in, her eyes soft but deliberate. "You're doing well now, aren't you? It would mean a lot if you could help out just until things even out." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking clock on the wall. I felt every eye on me waiting. I set my napkin down slowly and met their gaze. "I have my own responsibilities," I said quietly. "My apartment, my bills, my savings. I can't take on debts that aren't mine." My father's expression hardened. "This is your family, Hannah. We help each other." My mother's voice followed, tinged with disappointment. "You can't just sit there while we struggle, after everything we've done for you." I reached into my bag and placed my phone on the table. The screen lit up with saved messages, the same ones where they'd called me selfish and ungrateful. I didn't play them. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at them and said, "You told me I was dead weight. If that's true, then this burden isn't mine to carry." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Tyler looked down, pretending to scroll again. My mother's face paled, her smile fading. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. I stood smoothing the front of my jacket. "Thank you for the meal," I said softly. "I think we've said enough." I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, my mother's voice trembled. "Hannah, you're really going to leave us like this?" I paused for a moment, hand on the knob. "You left me a long time ago," I said quietly. Then I stepped outside. The cold air hit my face as I walked down the front steps. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving the street bathed in pale gold light. For a moment, I stood by my car, breathing deeply. My hands were shaking, but my heart felt steady. The porch light flicked on behind me the same way it had the night I left months before. Only this time, I didn't look back. As I drove away, the road stretched open ahead, the highway lights flickering in the distance. The city skyline came into view, steady and familiar. I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush in, the sound filling every quiet space that used to hold their voices. By the time I reached Cambridge, the streets were dark, the glow of my apartment window waiting like a small beacon. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, the lamps still on, my notes scattered across the desk, the faint scent of coffee in the air. I set my bag down, exhaled, and felt the kind of calm that doesn't need words. I poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and wrote a short line in my notebook. I spoke. I walked away. I'm free. Then I closed it and let the silence stretch around me, not as emptiness this time, but as peace. What I didn't know then was that peace wouldn't stay quiet for long. The fallout from that conversation was already moving toward me, slow, but certain, waiting for its turn to arrive. The drive home from Springfield lingered in my chest for days afterward. Even when I returned to my small apartment in Cambridge, the echoes of that dinner still hung in the air, the sound of my father's fork hitting the plate, my mother's disappointed sigh, the faint tremor in her voice as I walked away. I replayed the moment I shut their door behind me, half expecting guilt to catch up to me the way it always had before. But instead, something else took its place. Silence. Calm. Freedom. That night I sat at my desk, and wrote a single line in my notebook: "I will not explain myself again." Underneath it, I drew a line and added, "I will not let them rewrite my story." Then I turned off my phone completely. The steady buzz of messages had followed me all the way back from Springfield, but I wasn't ready to let their words fill this new space I'd fought so hard to build. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and took a long walk along the Charles River. The air was cool and still, the water catching the pale light of dawn. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was rushing to catch up with the day. I stopped at the railing, watching a row of early joggers pass by, and realized that for the first time, my life felt like it actually belonged to me. At the marketing firm, things began to change too. David, my supervisor, started including me in higher-level meetings. He trusted my input on projects and even asked me to co-present a campaign proposal. It wasn't just extra work, it was recognition. I stayed late one night to finalize the slides, and when the office emptied out, the hum of the printer was the only sound left. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes, and thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn that same kind of acknowledgement from my own family. The difference was that here effort didn't go unseen. 2 weeks later, the proposal was accepted. David called me into his office, a quiet smile breaking across his face. "You did good work," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "There's a bonus attached to this one. You earned it." I took it in my hands, the paper soft between my fingers. It wasn't about the money, it was about what it stood for. Proof that the nights I'd doubted myself had led somewhere real. Back home that evening, I opened the envelope and placed the check in a small glass jar on my shelf labeled Future. I didn't know exactly what I was saving for, only that it would be something that belonged entirely to me. The days turned warmer. I started jogging in the mornings again, the city alive with spring. Grace visited often, bringing iced coffees and stories from her clinic. "You look lighter," she said one afternoon, setting down her drink, "like you finally exhaled after holding your breath for years." I laughed softly, but her words lingered long after she left. For a while, everything felt steady. I focused on my work, my classes, and the quiet rhythm of living alone. Then late one Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a call from Vanessa. I hesitated before answering. Her voice was low and careful, the way it always was when she didn't want to startle me. "I don't mean to stir anything," she said, "but you should know Mom and Dad are struggling. The refinancing backfired. The loan payments are behind." I sank back on the couch, the words slow to settle. "And Tyler?" I asked. "He's still running that startup." She sighed. "Barely. He's burned through most of what Dad gave him. Now they're arguing every night about the money. I think Dad's business is suffering too." The line went quiet for a moment before Vanessa spoke again. "They might try to reach out again, Hannah. Just be ready." After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone in my lap. The calm I'd built over the past months wavered slightly, replaced by something colder. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of being pulled back into the same old storms. I knew what was coming next, the calls, the guilt, the half-hearted apologies wrapped in expectation. Sure enough, by the weekend, the messages began again. My mother's name flashed across the screen first. "We need to talk. Things are hard right now." Then my father's, "You've made your point, Hannah." But family doesn't abandon family. I didn't answer either one. By the next day, a new message arrived from Tyler. "You should help out. It's only fair." I set the phone face down on the table and let the room go quiet again. The sunlight slipped across the floorboards, warm against my bare feet. For a moment, I closed my eyes and pictured the house in Springfield, the porch light, the narrow driveway, the echo of their voices through the walls. It all felt so far away now, like a place I'd once visited but never truly lived in. On Sunday evening, I turned the phone back on, not to reply, but to look at everything one last time. The thread of messages stretched endlessly, each one a reminder of the distance between who I was and who they still wanted me to be. I scrolled through until I reached the very first one the night I'd left home. "If you want to stay, you'll pay rent." I stared at those words until they blurred, then deleted the entire thread. Every text, every voicemail, every trace of their control, gone. Afterward, I sat at the window, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. I didn't feel relief exactly. It was something quieter, a kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, just settles into the space where pain used to live. The following week, life continued its slow, steady climb. I was assigned to lead a small campaign on my own, a first. It meant late nights again, but this time I didn't mind. There was a purpose to every hour I stayed after dark, the office growing silent, except for the clicking of my keyboard. When the project launched successfully, David clapped me on the shoulder. "Keep this up," he said, "and we'll have to start calling you team lead." I smiled, not because of the compliment, but because it felt like another door quietly opening. By early summer, the air in Cambridge grew thick and warm. I walked home from work one evening with the sun low behind the buildings and the sound of laughter spilling from open cafe doors. At home, I cooked dinner, turned on the small radio by the window, and let the soft hum of jazz fill the room. The simplicity of it made me smile. It was the kind of night I used to imagine when life felt impossible. I was just finishing the dishes when my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Vanessa. "The house might go up for sale soon. Dad's trying to keep it quiet, but I thought you'd want to know." I read the message twice, then set the phone down. Outside, the city lights blinked softly in the distance, reflections rippling through the window. I didn't feel shock or sadness. I just whispered, "Let it go," and turned back to the sink. Later that night, I wrote one more line in my notebook, under the list of goals I'd made months before. Some things fall apart, so better things can take their place. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, spilling gold across the wooden floor. I poured a cup of coffee and stood at the window watching the city wake up. Somewhere far away, a house that had once felt like the center of my world was fading into memory. And here in a small studio in Cambridge, something new was quietly taking its place. I didn't know yet what the next season would bring, but I knew I was ready for it. What was lost no longer held power over me. What was coming next was mine to choose. When summer began fading into fall, I finally started to understand what peace felt like. It wasn't loud or certain. It was quiet mornings without tension, evenings without dread, days that felt fully my own. The rhythm of my life had settled into something steady. I worked, studied, saved, and came home each night to the soft glow of my little apartment. But peace has a way of being tested just when you start to trust it. It happened on a gray Wednesday afternoon. I was in a meeting at the firm when my phone buzzed repeatedly across the desk. I silenced it, but when it wouldn't stop, I glanced down. A string of missed calls, first from my mother, then my father. The last message preview froze me. Emergency. Call us now. For a moment, the room around me blurred. I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway. My mother answered on the first ring, her voice trembling. "Hannah, it's your father. He collapsed at work. They think it was stress-related. He's in the hospital." The words tumbled out in pieces, breaking under the weight of panic. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, told David there was a family emergency, and caught the first train to Springfield. By the time I reached the hospital, the sky had turned dark. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room hummed overhead as my mother paced near the vending machines. When she saw me, her face softened with relief and exhaustion. "He's stable," she said. "They think it was his heart. Too much pressure, they said." She gestured toward the hallway. "He's been asking for you." I walked into the small hospital room. My father looked smaller somehow, the edges of his confidence dulled by the IV line and the steady beep of the heart monitor. His eyes met mine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then quietly he said, "You came." I nodded, setting my bag down on the chair. "Of course I did." He exhaled the sound, thin and weary. "I wasn't sure you would." His voice carried no anger this time, only a quiet humility I'd never heard before. I stood by the bed, unsure how to answer. There were too many things between us that couldn't be fixed in one night. We sat in silence until he drifted to sleep. My mother entered the room softly, folding her arms. "He's been under a lot of pressure," she said. "The business is falling apart. The loan, the mortgage, it's all catching up." She looked at me, her eyes rimmed with red. "I know we've said things we shouldn't have, but, Hannah, we're drowning." I stayed still, watching the steady rise and fall of my father's chest. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. Their choices had led them here. but they were still my parents, fragile, human, and afraid. The next few days passed in slow motion. I took time off work and stayed at a nearby motel, visiting the hospital each morning. When my father was finally discharged, he asked if I'd ride home with them. The drive was quiet except for the low hum of the radio. The house looked unchanged from the outside, but inside it felt hollow, boxes stacked by the stairs, furniture, half-covered photos missing from the walls. "Are you moving?" I asked softly. My mother sighed. "We don't have a choice. The bank gave us 90 days. She tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. We thought maybe Tyler would take us in for a while, but he's struggling too. I nodded slowly. The old ache stirred in my chest, but it didn't twist the way it used to. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, and I meant it. Later that night, I found myself in my old bedroom. The walls were bare now, the shelves empty except for a few forgotten books. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the small drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a folded piece of paper, the note I'd written months earlier, when I left home, a simple line that read, "I have to choose peace." My mother must have kept it. The next morning, as I packed my things to leave, she followed me to the door. "You don't have to go so soon," she said. "Your father wants to talk when he wakes up." I hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come back this weekend," I said. "There's something I need to handle first." Back in Cambridge, the air felt lighter again, but a quiet thought stayed with me. Family might fail you, but it still leaves a trace. You can forgive without returning to the same place that broke you. That Friday at the office, David stopped by my desk. "How's your dad doing?" he asked gently. I told him the truth better, but facing hard times. He nodded, thoughtful. "You've handled a lot this year," he said, "and you've kept your focus. I wanted you to know we're promoting you Director of Financial Analysis." He slid a folder toward me. "Comes with a raise and equity package." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The title felt heavy in my hands, like something I'd been building toward without realizing. "Thank you," I said finally. He smiled. "You earned it." That night, I sat at my desk under the warm glow of the yellow lamp, looking at the offer letter. My father's voice echoed faintly in my mind, every doubt, every comparison, every reminder of not being enough. I picked up my phone, took a picture of the signed offer, and sent it to Vanessa with a short message. "We made it through. One of us had to break the pattern." Her reply came seconds later. "I'm proud of you, Hannah. Truly." Over the next week, I helped my parents organize their paperwork from a distance. I called the mortgage officer, found a pro bono financial advisor through my firm's community program, and arranged for them to meet. It wasn't money they needed from me anymore, it was direction. My father resisted at first, but eventually he accepted. It was the first time he'd ever taken my help without turning it into control. One evening, as I sat reviewing reports in my apartment, my phone rang. It was my father. His tone was soft, measured. "The advisor you found," he began, "she's helping us set things straight. I didn't thank you properly before." There was a pause then. "You were right to leave Hannah. I just didn't see it then." The words hung in the air. I felt something loosen inside me. Not joy, exactly, but a quiet release. "I know," I said gently. "I'm glad you're getting help." After we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As September drew near, I returned to Springfield one last time. The house stood half-empty, sunlight filtering through uncovered windows. My father sat on the porch, a box of old photos beside him. He looked up as I approached. "We're moving next week," he said, "to a smaller place near the river." I nodded, sitting beside him. We looked through the photos together, birthdays, vacations, moments that once felt ordinary. In one picture, a younger version of me stood at my college graduation, smiling despite everything. My father stared at it for a long time. "You've always been stronger than I gave you credit for," he said quietly. When I drove away that evening, the sky over Springfield was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of sunset that feels like an ending and a beginning at once. The porch light flicked on behind me, casting a soft glow across the front yard, but this time it wasn't calling me back. It was saying goodbye. By the time I reached Cambridge, night had settled over the city. I parked, climbed the stairs to my apartment, and opened the door to the familiar hum of quiet. The air smelled faintly of rain and fresh coffee. I sat by the window watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement and felt a calm I hadn't known before. My parents' story was no longer mine to carry. I had found my own written not in anger, but in endurance. Still, a part of me wondered what closure would look like when the past finally stopped reaching for me. I didn't know it then, but that answer was closer than I thought, and it would arrive sooner than I was ready for. A few months after my parents moved out of the house in Springfield, I received a small brown envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and an old photograph. The picture showed my family at a picnic years ago, sunlight, green grass, everyone mid-laugh. On the back, my mother had written, "We didn't know how to love you the way you needed. Thank you for showing us anyway." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time tracing the edges of that photo. It wasn't an apology wrapped in grand gestures, but it was enough. Somewhere between that sentence and the silence that followed, I realized I no longer needed more. The ache I'd carried for years had softened into something almost tender, like a scar that still existed but didn't hurt to touch. A week later, I drove out to see them. The new house was smaller, one-story, tucked near the river, where the trees bent low over the water. My father met me at the door, thinner now, but steadier. "We didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. I smiled. I wasn't sure I would either. My mother appeared behind him, apron dusted with flour, her eyes bright but careful. She invited me in with the same nervousness someone uses when handling fragile glass. The house smelled like baked bread and new paint. We sat around the small dining table, the three of us sharing a meal that felt strange at first, then slowly familiar. There were pauses, awkward ones, but no tension hiding behind them this time. My father asked about my work. My mother asked about Grace. They listened in a way they hadn't before, not out of pride or comparison, just quiet interest. When I stood to leave, my mother hugged me. It wasn't the kind of hug that asks for forgiveness. It was the kind that simply says, "I'm still here." My father extended his hand, then changed his mind and pulled me in too. "You're doing good things," he said. "I'm proud of you, Hannah." The words came out a little rough, but they landed softly. Driving back to Cambridge that evening, the world outside my window glowed in shades of orange and gold. The road stretched ahead long and open. I thought about the girl who had once packed a suitcase in the middle of the night, unsure if she'd ever find peace again. She wouldn't have believed this moment was possible, not the career, not the apartment filled with sunlight, not even this gentle kind of closure. When I reached home, I placed the photograph on my desk beside the small jar marked future. It reminded me that forgiveness doesn't always come as a single moment. It arrives quietly, piece by piece, until one day you notice the weight you've been carrying is gone. In the months that followed, life kept moving. I settled into my new role at work, mentoring interns the way others had once guided me. Grace and I started volunteering for a financial literacy program teaching young women how to build stability and confidence. On weekends, we'd laugh over coffee, remembering how far things had come since the nights I'd crashed on her couch with nothing but a suitcase and fear. Every so often, Vanessa would visit from out of state. We'd take walks along the river or cook dinner together in my kitchen, sharing quiet updates about our parents, how they were adjusting, how my father had started consulting part-time, how my mother had joined a local community garden. There was no fairy tale ending, but there was peace, and that felt far more lasting. One night I came home late from work and stood at the window watching the lights of the city ripple across the glass. My reflection stared back at me, older and calmer than the woman who had once doubted her own worth. I thought about everything that had led here, the hurt, the silence, the decision to walk away, the courage to return when I was ready. It all formed a single truth: you can't force people to see your value, but you can live in a way that makes it undeniable. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge or even apology. Sometimes it's simply choosing yourself again and again until peace feels like home. Before turning in, I reached for my notebook, the same one that had followed me from Grace's couch to this apartment. I flipped to the last page and wrote, "I didn't win or lose, I healed." Then I closed it and turned off the light. The night was quiet except for the hum of the city below, the sound of life still going on. And in that moment, I knew I had finally arrived, not at perfection, but at peace. If you've ever had to start over, if you've ever learned that walking away can sometimes be the bravest way to love yourself, I hope this story finds you when you need it most. Take a deep breath, hold on to your peace, and don't forget to share your story too. Someone out there might need to hear it.